Ryan, what was your like hardest or most uncomfortable conversation you ever had with a client?
Too many, but you know, on the sort of follow the thread that Paloma just started on. This was quite a few years ago. I had a husband and wife, and they had a very sort of tempestuous relationship. And you know, I was hired, and it was working with architects who I've worked with for many, many years, and who I have a great relationship with. We got through the sort of architecture planning stages with them, and you know, all was great. Everybody seemed to be incredibly happy. And you know, we went away to Nantucket for a week. And the second day that we were on the island, I get this phone call from the wife saying, "I'm sorry, but we have to let you go." And I said, "What are you talking about? I just left yesterday and everything was great." I mean, all the meetings had been great. There was no dissension, there was no disagreement, there was no nothing. And about, I don't know, 3 weeks went by, and all of a sudden I see that I have a voicemail from the wife. And of course, I'm looking at it and just thinking, I'm going to avoid this at all costs. I don't want to hear about it. In fact, actually, it's reminding me that we had bought some antique carpets for them. So I thought when the call came that she was probably going to ask the question about, you know, what do I do with the carpets? I don't want them, you know, give them back to the dealer. Well, in fact, she was calling back and saying, we know that we made the biggest, you know, mistake of our lives, you know, letting you go. We would, you know, beg and plead, you know, of you to come back. But, you know, in the moment, you know, situations like that are so awkward. And, you know, you lose faith, you lose confidence, you know, when you're treated that way and when messages aren't clear. And I mean, the long story short there, which is really a message about also what Paloma was saying, sort of the psychology of how we work with clients, is, you know, really kind of working with the two sides and trying to sort of keep it together and not allowing them to create a divide between them or between you and them that just creates these very, very uncomfortable situations.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian. It also shows, you know, it doesn't matter how long you're in the business, you know, something like that can always happen. Well, what was your most uncomfortable client situation?
I'll try to be brief. I think very similar to Paloma and to Brian is when somebody's wedged in between the client and me, and with this case it was an owner's rep, and clients with owner's reps are often a pain in the ass. And this was the part here that bothers me is when the owner's rep kind of translates on behalf of the client, and we had this like back and forth. We had multiple presentations. Everything was beautiful, going swimmingly. And then I got this email and it's like, "Hi, we're not moving forward, blah, 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 blah." And I was like, okay, I don't really understand what happened. And then having to deal with the owner's rep again, and then like having them translate on behalf of the client, or being able to speak directly to the client. Needless to say, we found out the whole series of events. The client ended up not wanting to sell wanting to sell the home. We ended up being hired to stage the home for them to sell it while they didn't buy the apartment. But case in point is in our contract now, very specific language about dealing with owner's reps and the client directly, and aspect.
Will, you're cutting out a little bit, and now I feel like you're cutting out a little bit. I don't know whether it makes sense whether it's able to stream or whether we just, you know, otherwise I just, you know, to shake the laptop or something. But I also heard that the connections are really bad for Benny, Brian, and Will. So I'm really surprised, but I'm gonna try something out. Okay, so I'm going out of the Wi-Fi now. Let's see how that works. So please, okay. So I'm here. We're getting a couple of chats. So we try that out on our sides, you know, and we're gonna be, you know, we're gonna be fine. It could also be your personal Wi-Fi, you know, why it's freezing, because I do hear a lot of comments now also that others, you know, feel like we are fine. While Will is dialing in again, let's take this to the next level. So I always think that you want to address the most important boundaries and rules from the beginning. I learned this as a strategy consultant, and it's a very different job from an interior designer, but you still, provide a service that is intangible and fairly expensive. So let's assume somebody reached out. Brian, maybe we start with you this time. So let's assume somebody reached out, they really want to work with you, and now you start discussing the contract and so on. How do you actually know whether you want to work with those clients before you even have started with them, like really interacting with them? Like, what are your, radars to assess that?
Well, I would say to start with, it has to be, generally there's going to be a conversation on the telephone, 1 or 2 calls. And, there's an outline of what the project is. You get a sense, they might send you some information. But the true test is, when you have that first meeting, it's like a blind date. And, I always love meeting clients for the first time, because you either have that, instinct of, I really want to work with them or not. To me, it's very black and white. There's no kind of gray area, and you just have to hope that, if your vibe is really good, really strong, and it's exciting and you like them, that it works out. I would say generally it does. So it's a very instinctive, feeling for me. If I have apprehension, then I will steer it away from falling in my lap.
Thank you, Brian. So for you, it's, mostly instinct. Paloma, how is that for you? What are your early warning systems, or what tells you, before the ink is on the contract, whether actually you want to work? Or is that actually a question you ask yourself?
Sure. I would echo Brian's sentiments. I think those are all really important markers. And a lot of it really is about that chemistry, because it is such a personal, long-standing relationship that you really have to enjoy one another's company and communicate in a positive way. But I would say red flags, you sort of have to look for the way that they treat people, your staff, the way that they treat your staff, I think is really indicative. If someone is really nice and kind to you, but dismissive of your team, that may indicate that they're not the nicest people to work with, potentially. I think sometimes it's just an intangible, and you have to listen to that inner voice and make sure that if something feels off, chances are it is, and you have to kind of just trust that. But I like to have the initial visit in the client's home whenever possible, so that I can see the space and make sure that it's something that I'm excited about, and that also, the visual goals align with the financial allocations as well. I think it's easier to know that once you step foot in the home. But you have to think about even the smallest, most minute detail. Do they offer you a glass of water when you are a guest in their home? Things like that, I think, speak volumes.
Well, how do you deal with that? Because there's also, it would be so easy if we could just like turn down any project where we feel like, maybe not, but there's obviously always a business need to that. So Oh, Will, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
I cut out for a second, but my biggest thing is a gut feeling when I meet the person, and it's about meeting them in person. And I think I have to sit in front of somebody and really look at their face and we're aligned if it's going to work. If not, I think that spells trouble down the line, and it's going to end badly for both people. So that's what I always try to do, is really get somebody in front of me and feel it and see if it's going to work.
How do you turn them down gracefully? I mean, how do you do you have like something prepared, or like how do you do that so that
I do have maybe a standard decline, but I always try and spin it in a positive way, which I think is important, and offer other people that we really don't do a lot of residential work. And so when we do residential work, it has to be something that we want to do and have a really major connection with the person. So I always try and turn them on to somebody else that's a friend that can really help them out, or that aligns better with what they're after, or their scope level for the work, or whatever it may be. But I think not just saying no and being blunt and rude about it, but then offering help on the other end. And that's always come back to, in a positive way for me, not only for the client, but also for the people that have gotten the work.
Paloma, would you do it similarly?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, you try to still be of service in some way by referring them to someone else who might be a good fit. And I would say you also want to make it more about you. Like, it's not you, it's me. Going back to, it's basically like dating people. Like, it's me, really. I'm the problem. But you can always just say, I don't have the bandwidth at the moment that your project deserves or requires or whatever, and turn it down as gracefully as possible, because you never know, they might, refer someone your way, or it's such a small world and our reputations really are everything. So you want to treat everyone with dignity and kindness.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you. Brian, let's assume, we like the client, the scope aligns, and everything is great. So, and you start getting into a contract negotiation. What's your number one advice how to conduct that?
I think I would start with being realistic, about what's involved. So typically our jobs involve a lot of architectural work, and so I'm going to begin with the whole, sort of how are we going to address working with the architect? What is the program for the project? How much involvement is going to be required on my side or my team's side? And starting with that, all these clients want to know. The first question everybody always asks is, what's it going to cost? I mean, I just went through this in the last few days with a potential new client, and I've got the plans. They sent me all of that. They sent me some photographs, but not having a sense of who they are, it's very hard to have that conversation. So I sort of put it off of that. But I like to talk about the process and explain how we work and the steps that we go through to make sure that that's going to be a comfortable conversation for them, and also to sort of determine what their level of interest in collaborating and working together, whether it's going to be working closely or not, because there are some clients that really just want to be brought in for the big strokes, and others that really want to be very involved in all the details. I love the details, so I love it when a client is interested in all of that. But every project's different, every client's different. I just try to have a very truthful conversation when we start out with the contract. Our contract really spells it out very clearly, so I always give them that to start with if it gets to that point. And generally that comes back to questions and answers.
I mean, we're gonna get also a little more specific in a minute on components of the contract that you guys, besides the obvious ones you find important. But Will and Paloma, maybe we start with you. I would also love to hear from you. What's your number one advice that you would give to somebody, just like telling you, I have a conversation with a new client tomorrow. Like, what would be your advice, Will?
Mine is always be upfront and don't hide anything as you're getting there, because it's the same thing. If you don't align with the person at the very beginning, it's going to lead to trouble down the road. And so I always say, be honest. If you can't do the work, don't fake it. It's not going to come back. You're going to end up looking like the idiot at the end of the day. And really just put all of your cards on the table and ask them to do the same. And I think at that point you end up in a happier marriage and nothing is really hidden. And I think that also builds the opportunity for conversation throughout the process, because then you're not scared to have those conversations as the process keeps going. And yeah, I think that's always it, is conversation and honesty.
Paloma, what's your advice?
Well, I would echo what both Will and Brian said. I think that laying out the expectations and explaining very specifically your process and the way that things work with your team is really important up front, because that is what helps to establish both trust and transparency, which I think are two of the hallmarks that make for a truly successful designer-client relationship.
Thank you. So now let's assume we are in the contract, or we are writing the contract. Paloma, maybe we start right away with you again. What would be the three, and you alluded already in your intro, but what would be your 3 components beyond the obvious ones, you know, like about like I put fee structure in it, like what would be the 3 components that you always have in your contract?
Well, we have a pretty long contract. It covers a lot of different things. And I'd say one of the things that I think makes it maybe different is that we really do reiterate what the process is in the contract itself. And so by the time that a client is signing on to work with us, they've heard about our process and the various steps for us to get from, you know, that initial meeting to the installation and full concept completion. They've heard it on the initial phone call, at the first in-person meeting, any sort of email correspondence that we have in between then, and then it's repeated again in a very tangible way in the contract so that they know that this is the way that we work, and that's spelled out up front. We also include things that are not in the budget. We do a lot of projects outside of our hometown of Houston. And so we talk about travel and other expenses that are not included there, which I'm sure most of you have in your contracts. And then I also put in something about our hours and our preferred method of contact, because I can't tell you how often clients will text, and sometimes they'll text, you know, on a Sunday night at say 10 p.m. and it's not because they need to bother you necessarily, but that's just when they have time or when they think about it. And sometimes if a client doesn't already understand those boundaries on their own, it can become very frustrating. And again, it's about setting that expectation so they know that if they contact you within these hours, you will reply by a certain time. And if it's over the weekend, they can expect to hear back from you on Monday. And it's just in writing. We don't always abide by it. It's hard to keep myself from wanting to respond right away, but at least it's there.
Very interesting. Thank you, Paloma. Brian, you have so many decades of experience. You know, you probably
Hey,
seen
watch
it
it. Watch it.
You know how this is meant. So what?
Well, can I just interrupt for a second? I just have to laugh because what Paloma just said, I'll never forget. I had a client call up on a Saturday evening years ago, and she said, you know, my husband's freaking out. A leg just broke off the back of the sofa. You know, he was sitting in it. And I remember saying to her at the time, which then did make its way into a contract, but I said, it's Saturday night. There is nothing I can do until Monday morning. So I would really appreciate in the future if you'd not let me know until the beginning of the week, because I really don't want to lose sleep over something like that. But I mean, back to the contract front, we have to sign a lot of confidentiality, you know, agreements. So, you know, with that can sometimes, you know, come with the caveat that you can't, you know, photograph work, you can't publicize work and all of that. So the one, you know, line in the sand for me is we have to be able to photograph everything we do at the completion. You know, that's non-negotiable for me. And that's the biggest thing. Everything else I find, you know, during the course of negotiating and conversation, which I was going to say before too, what I should have said is communication. When you start with these clients, communication is the most critical aspect of all the work that we do, is having a line of communication and making sure that they're going to be open and honest and candid, because, you know, I consider myself a problem solver. So, you know, you come to me with a problem. If there's a problem with the contract, with the language of the contract, we'll figure it out. We'll work it out. Not a problem.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Will, what have you learned to put into the contract over the years?
A lot of things, a lot of similar elements to both Paloma and Brian. Continuing the thread of travel time, I think it's a big one for us that we put into our contract. Is anytime, even if we're out of our office and we're on our way to a job site for a client or something, that is time that is dedicated to them and that they're paying for. So I think that's an important one for me, because we realized how many hours that we lost in transit to and from a job site or something like that. So we've included that in contract so that it's very clear that if you are asking us to visit the job, or if we're going to a vendor, or if we're doing something like that, you're paying for it. Another one I think that's super important is additional services. And that is anything for us that falls outside of the very defined scope of work on the preceding pages. And oftentimes it's overlooked, and we've gotten stung so many times from other people that we've worked with. And I think for us, it became anytime that we do go above and beyond the scope, it's easy to go above and beyond the scope, and you want to go above and beyond the scope, but making sure you're being compensated for it, I think is super important. And just making sure that the client is aware that, you're getting 3 renders of this room out of your contract, but if you want to keep going to 5, 6, and 7, you're going to be paying for it. And I think that's often overlooked, and a place that a lot of people, it's hard as a designer to make money at the end of the day, I think. And that's a place where you can start being more business savvy, and making sure that you are compensated for your time.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah. Hey, Benny, can I add a
Brian,
thought to that too?
Yeah,
Because I just want to go back to the time charges, because I remember when I started my business, even though I'd been a partner at Parrish Hadley and, was, involved in the business side of it, I didn't realize until I had my own company the value of your time. And don't shortchange yourself. And it's easy to do. You're starting a business, you're young in the business, and you feel like you don't really have that worth, but you can't. Don't take that away from yourself, because it is so important. And we spend, as Will just said, we spend so much more time above and beyond the real scope with all the additional things that, people dream up or come up with, or it just expands, and we allow it to from a design standpoint. So it's just very careful to keep it all very clear and really hit on the points that are important to each individual as a designer, when setting up contracts.
I mean, pricing is such an important topic, and I see also a lot of people asking here in the chat about pricing. I would, I have a question about pricing right now, actually, but also for like super detailed questions of how other interior designers do pricing and so on. You're going to get the link after the webinar today. We have another webinar from, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago, where we discussed that in detail. You can look that up on YouTube, and everybody who's watching, you're going to get the link after today. Paloma, but I don't want to dive into your pricing structure and so on, but I would love to understand how you have that conversation, because a lot of clients, either have unrealistic expectations, because they do not know what a sofa costs, and then they do not understand why your value is then either 20 or 30 or 40% markup, or an hourly fee, or however we charge. How do you explain to them the value, so that you do not have to explain to them your value every single time you see them again during the project?
Well, the way that I explain it is basically, there isn't a standard markup per se, because my access is different from one vendor to the next. If I'm shopping for antiques, I have a very small discount on something like that I can't necessarily pass on, and I need that money for my firm. However, if I'm able to buy directly from a manufacturer at true wholesale, or we're doing something custom, there's more flexibility there. And so what I tell them is that to try to discourage the shopping online, we will charge you basically the retail, the advertised retail, or in the event that we can have some flexibility, it'll be below that, but never over. So I don't mark up over retail. But I try to frame it as, you're not paying me to be a personal shopper for you. We're not a shopping service. It really is about the full design, the service, the fact that you're not having to wait at your door for packages to arrive and dealing with things when they are damaged or the wrong thing is sent. It really is turnkey, full service interior design. And that is something that is truly valuable, especially for someone who is busy and not inclined or able to do those things. So you're paying me for my creativity, as well as for the tried and true systems that our team has in place.
Thank you, Paloma. I find that very interesting, Brian, because, I don't know how much you run into this, but clients, finding something online and say, oh, I found it a little cheaper, that we actually, as designers, even get defensive about it. Of course, they find it cheaper because there's no service attached. So how do you explain to clients your fee structure and the value of your work?
Well, we break it down. So, what Paloma was hitting on, if you're buying at retail and it's a retail establishment that doesn't provide a discount, then we charge a shopping fee for that. What we've tried to do over the years, because it became increasingly difficult, you tried to tailor the contracts to different clients, and it becomes so complicated from one client to the next that for the project managers, you'd have to have a sheet, like a cheat sheet, so you'd know for this client, what are you doing? So we've tried to standardize the percentages that we charge, the fees that we charge, to keep it as consistent. We also have a few clients that really like to work from a design fee, so that we set up a monthly fee paying, and which can be very helpful, and particularly in uncertain times like now, because it's very hard in a business like ours where you're generating estimates for all the work that you're doing. And, an estimate is a client either approves it or not. And if they decide to sit on it, which some clients can do for 3, 4, 5 months, you're not making any money for all the work that you've already put into, being able to generate the estimate. So, it's important to really be very straight and clear on the bookkeeping and billing aspect of, doing these jobs and how we do it. But I would say the easiest for us has been standardizing the fees to a certain percentage point for the for the different, whether it be antiques, whether it be artwork, whether it be upholstery curtains, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
That way you eliminate the client then coming back and trying to negotiate. That does. I mean, I know that's another question, but that does still happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, how do you try to, because there's a lot of clients also who don't know, what the fee structures are and what industry standard is and so on. Also, as service providers, we try to keep all of behind the curtain away from the client, so they don't even know how much work we put into that. Well, how do you explain your value?
I think the number one question, like somebody said it earlier, I think Brian, or maybe it was you, but they want to know how much it's going to cost. And so from the beginning, and even with all of my furniture, with everything, and what's it going to cost? And so when we do a contract that's lengthy, we try to estimate all of the components of it. So there's a flat fee for all of the design scope that we're working on, the architectural work, renovation work, all of that stuff. On top of that, we try to estimate the number of hours it's going to take for installation, for FF&E management, for vendor management, for all that stuff, so that there's a number that they can kind of get their head around. And then really the markup, I think, calling it, so we try and be so straightforward about that, from art all the way up to furniture is across the board. There's different levels of the percentage, but just really detailing all of the percentages so that it's super clear. Oftentimes they'll come back and say, hey, can you go from 40 to 30 or 25 to 30 or whatever it may be. At that point you can have that conversation, but putting it all on paper and then really going over with them so that they understand and they can see at the end of the day, really, okay, your furnishing budget is 1.5 million, your markup is going to be, say, average 25%, and then you can understand what you're going to be paying at the end of the day. Because I think oftentimes they're like, oh, I'm going to spend, I have $75,000 or $750,000 for furniture. And that's all I'm going to spend. But then they don't realize that you have 30% on top of that. And so they're when they calculate it, I think we try to get them to the point where they understand the all-in number before we begin.
So now comes my favorite question, and Will, you already alluded to it. So let's assume you build all this beautiful budget. You are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months in, and Paloma, the client, comes proud to you and says, look, the sofa that you quoted for $5,000 or the fabric or whatever it is, I found online in a similar good fabric, the sofa for 20% less or whatever, whatever the amount is. How do you deal with that? Do you address the e-shopping before, and do you accommodate that? Do you say, well, if you do this, do it, but then you're going to install it yourself and you deal with the claim yourself? How do you deal with that?
Well, we really try to address it and discourage it from the onset. And I explain it in the sense that, once you start pulling at a thread on a sweater, let's say, you start pulling on that thread a little bit, eventually the whole thing's going to fall apart. And the reason that we like to be the ones in control of the procurement process is so that we can stay on track, both with the timeline and with the budget. And we've done this a million times before, so we know that we're going to get to the finish line in the way that we need to. If we start letting you shop for piecemeal things here and there, that just sort of breaks down the chain of command, if you will, and the process that we have in place. At the end of the day, it's their home, it's their money. If they want to buy the sofa, they're going to buy the sofa. I mean, ultimately, I can't physically stop them from doing it. But if that happens, then, you know, it's a situation where I say, okay, then you're assuming responsibility. You're handling the order. If something goes wrong, I'm not involved in that. But a lot of that can be avoided also just by the sources that you're using. If you're buying a ton of stuff at retail, then you're opening yourself up to that possibility. If you're making a lot of custom upholstery and custom case goods, or buying antique and vintage and things like that that are truly more unique to your project, you won't run into that problem quite as often.
Mm. Brian, let me spice this question a little up, you know, because like, don't you think the problem is not whether you're going to lose the sale on, you know, I don't know, the $200 on the sofa, but that it's actually a much bigger issue of the client not trusting you and not understanding why it's more expensive getting it through you than finding it online?
We don't, I mean, I have to say, we don't have many clients that are buying online. And frankly, we don't have many clients that are, you know, buying things independently from us. But that actually goes back to the contract, because I do have a clause in the contract that if a client is, you know, shopping, say, you know, for instance, they're in Europe, they see something they love, you know, the line that's very important to me is, that's fine, but you need to share it with me so that we can make sure it's appropriate. You know, it's the correct scale, it makes sense, blah, blah, blah. If it is something that we have already been shopping for, then you are responsible for paying a fee. If it's, you know, independent, and in some cases where we have clients that we know they're going to be predisposed to wanting to maybe find some things, and it may even just be accessories and things like that, we sort of pull it out of the budget and say, fine, you be responsible for that, we're not going to do it. But we also do very copious budgets. And, you know, we have this whole discussion about a range. I just had this with a new client the other day, you know, talking about upholstery, for instance, and saying, you know, we have different levels of workrooms. We have the workrooms where it's extremely custom. It's, you know, unique pieces, special finishes, very complicated shapes. So you need a particular type of workroom, you know, versus you've got your, you know, basic Bridgewater chair. You know, we've got, you know, a much less expensive workroom that does a beautiful job on a Bridgewater chair. So, you know, we try to play the game, you know, in different ways depending upon the client. So for me, that's an easy conversation to overcome.
It's very interesting because you say, look, like if they pick something, it's fine unless we have already selected it. And in the contract, it says if we have selected it, they're still going to pay the fee. I think that takes, you know, also a lot of frustration out on the designer side, obviously.
And it discourages the clients because they know that what they're probably going to find in many cases is not going to be as interesting as what you're going to show them. So therefore, they're going to be less inclined, you know?
Yeah. Will, how do you deal with that? Like the whole e-shopping thing?
Similar to Brian, not a lot of people do it. I think one way is a bit of a fear tactic, and I know that sounds scary, but there is something that works from like a psychological perspective about really trying to get them to understand why they've hired you. And like, if, you know, like you hired a designer to do the job, you didn't hire yourself to do the job. So why are you the expert all of a sudden and going to do that? And just having that conversation kind of rephrases the conversation in their mind. I think, and it's very rare that you have a client that has like very sophisticated aristocratic taste. And in that case, like go for it all out. You know, like I want to collaborate with you and do this together. In the other case, I think it really is contractually putting it in there, and that little nugget of you are still going to pay. Yes, sure, you can buy this blanket, but we had it in our budget, and so you're going to pay the markup because we had already selected something. So I think that's important. On top of the I'm the professional conversation, and not in a haughty way, but like, why are you paying to hire a designer if you're going to do the work or try to do the work yourself. And I think that they often realize like, oh, you're the professional. And it's like, your doctor, you wouldn't get your own prescriptions. Your doctor has to write your prescription. You wouldn't write your own legal papers. Your lawyer is going to write your legal paper. So I'm the one that's going to make your sofa, or I'm the one, I think that professional service mentality is also a way to approach it.
I also, and if I may add to that, because, I get this question a lot on all my travels too, from interior designers who I meet. And I always also try to explain that, it starts with the fact, does your client actually know all the work that goes into shopping a sofa, from like assessing the scale, doing the elevations, choosing the fabric, speaking with the upholsterer, doing the logistics, dealing with the claim, the installation, all of, maybe storage and so on. And I'm sure I, forgot a lot of steps. Like that is why they pay more than for just buying the sofa directly, where they would have to do all of that. And that is why I always suggest to like make transparent the work you do. People do not understand, electricity comes out of the outlet, that mentality they have too, and they do not think about everything that is behind that outlet. I strongly suggest also everybody explains that very early in the process, if I may add.
We call it the twilight zone, and like trying to illuminate the twilight zone, because it is, they don't see, me sitting on a computer or an assistant sitting on a computer going back and forth with an upholsterer or something like that, a fabric house, figuring out the yardage. Okay, we don't have 2 dye lots, we have 1 dye lot, blah, 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 blah. All of that is so much time. And so we try and every time that argument comes up, it's like, okay, here's actually the amount of hours that were tracked working on this one piece. So now this is what you're paying for it.
Yeah, thank you. So we have 15 minutes left, and I wanted to, as I said at the beginning, I wanted to come to the Q&A session. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to read questions. I try to shorten them because some of them are very long, and whoever has the answer first answers. We do this quick so that we can get through as many questions as we can. Does that sound fun?
Can't wait.
Okay, good. Okay, perfect. So I have a wonderful press opportunity in a coveted shelter magazine. The house was shot with the client's approval and interviews have taken place, but suddenly the client wants to pretty much, position themselves as the co-designer and make that article about themselves. How do you, and posting also personal social media and so on and so forth. How do you deal with that? Any suggestions?
I think that's a tough one because it depends what the circumstance is, and how is the client suddenly able to redirect the focus away from what you've done to create it, that suddenly they're kind of making it their own. That happened to me once with the World of Interiors, and it was very upsetting, and I was not aware of it until the magazine came out. That ended up becoming a conversation with the husband, actually. But it was after the fact, so it was a bit irrelevant.
I say take the win, and if you have the opportunity to publish, regardless if your name is in lights or if the client's name is in lights, whether frame it as a collaboration or something, but that press piece is going to be so important, and getting published is not easy. So I would say have the conversation, but move forward and get as much in it as you can. Use your elbows and head for it.
Thank you. Thank you for both pieces of advice. Next question from Jean Nielsen. What is the best way to educate the client on a realistic cost for a project? Most of my clients don't have any idea what the budget is. This is one of my biggest challenges. Paloma, do you have an answer to that?
Well, sometimes people really don't know. And so it's helpful for them to establish a range. And one exercise that I find can help them to get to that place is having them share rooms that they've seen either in magazines or books or preferably in your own portfolio that they like and that they would like a similar feel and level, of quality. And then as a designer, you're able to sort of steer them and say, okay, well, this kind of room costs $150,000. This room is $400,000. And then that's really eye-opening to them, where they can see, okay, that's what it's going to take. And they can then start to wrap their heads around what the entire home might cost then. But there's different levels. And so that's really helpful too, in helping people understand. I think somebody, I forget who earlier, alluded to, I think Brian, certain work rooms can execute a certain level of upholstery, and those things they have a different cost associated with them.
Yeah, thank you. Next question, and I combined two. So first, do you go through every single point of the contract with the client together before they sign it? And how do you react if they make a comment of like, oh, you must be a troublemaker, it's such a long, extensive contract?
No, I let them mull it over on their own and really take their time to digest it. I usually leave that with them after our first in-person meeting and have them take the time to read over it. Let me know if they have questions we can discuss over the phone. I don't typically change my contract very much for anyone. And I find that if somebody's really wanting to get you to change the way that you do things and the way that you've structured your business and your procedures, that's a big red flag, because those procedures and those policies exist for a reason. They most likely were put in place because something happened at some point. And when you take away those levels of protection, issues can arise.
Yeah, I think, can I just add to that? You don't want to change your business practice to accommodate a client. The client has to accommodate your practice the way it's set up. And that's very important, because I've been there and tried that, and it does not work.
Thank you, Brian. Sorry, I just like a huge truck drove by and I felt like we're going to have the background noise for the rest of the call. Next question for the group. How do you handle clients that want to bring on their own contractor or trades that you have never worked with?
For me, it's, that comes down to a Q&A. And again, that's part of developing a relationship with the client. And if they're suggesting somebody that's really qualified, I have no problem with that. But if it's somebody that in my sort of background check, or, if I'm checking references, that there's a red flag, I'm going to be very candid about that. I had that happen a few years ago on a project in Connecticut, and it was a recipe for disaster. And I was able to avert it, but it required being very blunt, with the client about, what the outcome was probably going to be, not necessarily, but probably, from my experience. And, they either had to, heed your advice or not. In this case, they did, which was good. So, I think it always comes down to honesty and speaking truth.
And references, I would say, like, make sure that they know the types of references, A, that you're using in the job, and then B, that work that you've seen that they've done. Oftentimes, like, oh, I'm a contractor, and I'm a client, and I have a friend that's a contractor that's done Stephen Gambrella's projects, or Brian McCarthy's projects, or Paloma Contreras' projects. Great, that's a good sign, but make sure that you check and like that they have something to support the work.
It's a really good advice too. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. What do you do when clients argue, push back on the hours for those details that you have, put your time in? How do you defend your stance without taking a major hit to your profit?
Prove it. I would say we track our hours. Try by the half to 60 minutes, and just make sure, at least if there's a ballpark, you have an idea of what somebody's spent working on the amount of time somebody spent working on something. It's the surefire way to be able to go back to the client and say, look, this is actually how much time it took, because we have proof.
Yeah, everything has to be documented. So if you're sending time charges, it has to be very, very clear what precisely the charge is for, what was the time spent on. I don't like time charges for that reason, because we're not really set up to do it. It's so easy to get kind of fractured in the middle of something, and so you're 10 minutes on and 10 minutes off. But it's as much information as you can give. Just gives clients confidence that you're being truthful, factual, and that they understand.
some clients are really known for changing their minds. You know, you've selected something and so on. Alice Silverman asks, you know, do you have your clients sign invoices before purchasing so that that can't happen?
100%. Purchase orders and invoices, making sure that they know that it was actually one of our pre-questions, but if they get a sofa and they hate it, they've already signed the purchase order, they've approved the fabric, they know the size, they've sat on the density of the foam or the down or whatever you're making your sofa out of, and they know the product that they're getting. And I think that's so important, because then you're not stuck with something.
Yeah, the estimate's a legal contract. So when the client, it's why it's so important that they sign it, because they assume the responsibility. And that is, we're not a lending library, so we can't be taking returns, because there's no, you know, when you're doing something as bespoke, you know, there isn't a return policy where you can just reuse it easily for somebody else.
Yeah, it's interesting. Palma Weiss from San Francisco said a couple of webinars ago, you know, what she says, I'm sorry, I'm not running a bank. I'm just an interior designer. So do me the favor and pay me, you know. And I think she nails it with that. Kathleen Penny asked, how do I go above and beyond for my clients, which I consider part of my service and is also innate to my brand, but then charge for that? I feel like there is a sweet spot between here and not sure what it is. So like, how do you deal with that between like giving people more because that's like who you are and charging for that?
I think it's you have to kind of use your gut, and that's the way I do it. It's like, okay, if I'm going to dinner with a client, I'm not charging you for my time to go to dinner with you, because we're going to have a nice conversation. But if you are like asking me to come to your home and we're going to talk about the new bunk beds for your daughter, you know, that is time that is my brain working creatively. And I think that's an important part to differentiate, is like, when is it personal and something that you're going above and beyond to make sure that the client is satisfied with the whole kit and caboodle of the work, versus when are they kind of blowing hot air and wasting time. I'm sure you have other answers. I don't know. That's how I do it.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you. I'm already on to the next question from Sarah Abercrombie. If you know a shopper, should you search the web before proposing items that may be found on discount sites? This takes more time, and time is dollars. Like, do you do that? Would you do that?
We do that anyway in some cases, because you know that it's, you know, it's not a unique piece. So, you know, if first of all, we don't buy a lot online, but if we are doing something like that, you know, and particularly depending upon the client, because we do have a client that does like to sort of surf on the internet and see what they can find. So, you know, we will try to do our due diligence as much as we can. And we're also very good about negotiating, you know, on clients' behalf.
I think especially with even antiques and vintage and stuff like that, because First Dibs does exist, and they can go and find out that this Kai Christensen chair or whatever you're showing them is $600 and you're showing it to them for $1,200. Like, why is this one $1,200 and this one $600? To be prepared for that conversation. There are so many resources now that clients can use, and so just knowing what might come back to you when you show something.
Totally.
Paloma, is that how you do it too?
Yeah, I mean, we do our due diligence as well, and just make sure that we know what's out there in case they track down some breadcrumbs, and we're prepared with an answer and are educated about, you know, what we're presenting.
Has one of you ever had a client who didn't want to pay you or refused to pay for your design time, or like after an initial design presentation doesn't want to move forward? How would you handle that? Amy asks.
Well, we charge a non-refundable design fee, and that essentially is for that block of time at the beginning of a project where you're, you know, developing furniture plans, you're doing all the, you know, the scheming and all of that. So it kind of gets you through that initial period before you actually are estimating, and, you know, that way you don't run into that problem. You know, it's a safety measure.
Yeah, we do the same. I would say if you're just starting out and you're not sure how to structure, don't do any upfront work. I know Will might have a different opinion. In hospitality, it can be a little bit different, but on the residential side, we're not designing anything for you or putting together a presentation until we have a retainer. Once we have money in our pocket, then we will start our work for you.
You know, what I love about all your advice, you know, what I'm taking away from also today is a lot is about proactive communication, you know, going through the contract and also putting your foot down, not let, you know, like not being pushed, because also a lot of your clients, you know, have become successful because they always get more, you know, like they do that in their jobs and they test you. So that's something that I really take away from all of your advice. Maybe we end with one question that I got here and from somebody anonymous, but I really like it. And I think we've all been there already. How do you deal with clients who have a bad taste or people that just like keep changing their minds? How do you navigate through that process?
I find it easy, actually, in a funny way, because if a client is coming to you because they really love what you do, even if they have bad taste, generally, you know, what I always do is the question becomes, you know, what can't you live without? And then you sort of deduce from that as you begin to develop plans, you know, what makes sense, you know, what speaks to the language, you know, that you're developing for the project. And, you know, generally, if the project is running long enough, as you begin to develop it and you start presenting and you get them excited, those things, you know, or that, you know, you through the process, you elevate their taste and you elevate the eye. And so I found, you know, if it's particular things in general that I don't like, they typically find a way out the door. And it's not you making that decision. It's usually the client understanding by the time you get to that point that it doesn't really make sense. And they can then kind of let go of the sentimental attachment that they may have.
I think a lot of that too is education. And going back to something I said earlier is positioning yourself as a professional, because you are being hired. They're paying you money to do this job. And so when you are a professional, using your wit and your abilities to educate them as much as possible so that they want to be a part of the process and they're excited by the process. And all of a sudden they have you make them think that they have good taste, even though they don't, or they might not. And so like it's a little bit of a slide of the hand. But anyway, I think that piece is interesting to see, and it happens often in jobs like that, where the client takes on the professional look that you have.
It's the art
Paloma, go ahead, Brian.
It's the art of seduction. Really, you know.
Well, let me put it. That's a whole different webinar. Paloma, how do you deal with clients? How do you deal with clients that are like that?
Well, it's education. I mean, like Will said, a lot of our job is educating clients as to why something works and why it doesn't. You know, I try not to lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, it's their home. And if there's a hideous chair that the husband cannot live without and we have to use it, then we find a way to make it work. You know, ultimately they buy into, as Brian said, they're hiring you for a reason because they like your work and they want you to execute this vision for them in their home. And so you really, that building that trust from the beginning, going back to that transparency and the trust, that will help them to get on board. It's really important that happens. But yeah, I mean, you just have to sort of guide them down the right path, if you will. And if something you just has to be included, then we might just have to pull it out of the frame for the photo shoot and then put it back.
Or put it in the basement, or just keep moving it to a place that they hate it more and more, and then it just disappears.
That's true.
I think it goes back to what we've all said too. It's about the homework that you put into it. And, you know, Paloma started to hit on it before when she was talking about clients and pictures and showing images of things. We do, you know, I always ask clients whether they keep an image book, but we even will do an image book for them to show inspiration and ideas, whether it be architectural or decorating, you know, just to, again, it just helps establish a point of view. And that's the key thing, I think. It also is a window. It also lets you know how they communicate, how they see. Can they read two-dimensionally? Does it have to be three-dimensional? You know, it's all these questions that come up, which goes back to, the importance of communication in general.
Yeah, importance of communication, and also the importance of front loading the communication. The more you discuss at the beginning, even if you feel like, and also the uncomfortable, there's the rule, whatever you find uncomfortable, the longer you wait, it's just going to be more uncomfortable. So go for the less uncomfortable early. Yeah, thank you very much, Brian, Paloma, Will. I got here already so many comments in the chat saying thank you. This was awesome. Thank you for taking the time out of your day. And also to all participants, thank you very much for listening in today. You're going to get the link for today and for all the other webinars that we did in the past. And we're going to have one next week again, how to use your home as your calling card, which I also think is kind of exciting. And yeah, it's quarantine time, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Benny.
Bye.
Bye, Will.
Bye.
Bye, Paloma.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Brian. Good to
Take
see you.
care.